I am officially running for President of the United States.
While no one expects Trump to get close to winning the nomination, that doesn't mean that they're happy he's in.
I think that if we look back on last night, it is likely to be the beginning of the end of Donald Trump sitting atop the GOP field.
I take any bet that it won't happen. So I just think it's a phenomenon of reality television as politics.
I think you have to acknowledge one thing. This is Trump's 101st day of leading in the polls.
If Donald Trump goes on to win South Carolina after all that, I think it's very difficult to stop him.
I continue to believe Mr. Trump will not be president. And the reason is because I have a lot of faith in the American people.
Well, the U.S. President Barack Obama may still be a skeptic, but there is a growing, if sometimes incredulous, sense that Donald Trump is on a roll that may just lead him to the White House. The tone in the coverage of Mr. Trump's campaign has certainly changed since he launched his presidency bid back in June. After wins in South Carolina and New Hampshire primaries, polls for tonight's Nevada caucuses have him once again firmly in the lead. The snickering has pretty much stopped as pundits and the Republican establishment try to come to grips with the idea of Donald Trump leading the GOP into the next U.S. election. We have assembled a panel to discuss what is ahead for Donald Trump, the Republican Party, and the looming presidential election. Stephen Strauss is the John L. Weinberg and Goldman Sachs and Company visiting professor at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. Stephen Strauss joins us from Princeton, New Jersey. Shayla Nunnally is the professor of political science and African studies at the University of Connecticut. She joins us from Storrs, Connecticut. Sasha Issenberg is a contributor to Bloomberg Politics and the author of The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. He is in Las Vegas, Nevada. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi. Hello.
Stephen Strauss, I want to start with you. Back in June, the idea of a President Trump seemed completely unrealistic. How would you describe his chances now?
Just to give a flavor for it, 60-40 for the nomination, but I'm still not seeing him as president, maybe 10 or 20% chance to the presidency.
And what scenarios do you see that could lead to a presidency for Donald Trump?
Well, first is going through the primaries. And that at the moment is looking pretty good for him. The Republican primaries are very often winner take all, various variations from proportional. But basically, if he keeps polling 30 to 40% and the other the other people who are going for the presidency stay in the race, he's going to go into the convention either with the largest block of votes or quite large, possibly with a majority. So that pathway, I think everyone's agreeing there's a clear path there. On the presidency, I tend to agree with President Obama. I don't think the American people have lost their senses. I have a great deal of respect for the common wisdom. I do think Trump's path to the presidency is much harder. He's going to have to pivot himself to the middle without losing his base. And I think he's also going to need some kind of an exogenous shock that hurts the Democratic nominee. Maybe another financial crisis, a 9/11 type event. If it's Clinton, her legal problems blow up in a really bad way during the campaign. But barring those kind of exogenous shocks, well, I think Trump can get the nomination. I don't see him getting the presidency.
This is hard for you, isn't it, Stephen Strauss? You don't really like this.
It's an interesting experience.
Okay, well, Shayla Nunnally, what scenarios do you think could lead Donald Trump to the White House?
Well, I do believe that it is a matter of turnout. So in seeing the American public and the way that we have witnessed public opinion, and particularly how we see that the two major parties, quite honestly, appeal to racial groups, and what that means for how we have seen the historic election of 2008, 2012, as far as the Obama presidency, and the contribution of African American as well as Latino voters, and importantly, what has been a split across party lines as far as African American Latino voters supporting mostly the Democratic Party and an increasing number of white voters supporting the Republican Party. It really is a matter of how much these groups will turn out to the polls and what that will mean for the Trump candidacy, even as Professor Strauss mentioned, being able to appeal to that moderate voter, and in particular what that means for white voters and whether or not they will turn out for Trump, especially as Republican voters, or whether or not Trump may have a suppressing effect on that turnout.
And we've just been hearing that in the news, Shayla, of other Republicans warning Republicans will stay home.
Yes, and so I really do believe that this will depend upon who will be on that ticket, who will be that vice presidential candidate who may balance out the temperament that perhaps Republican voters see that may be somewhat distracting as far as their support of the Trump candidacy. If that candidate is able to balance out Trump's candidacy, then we may well see a difference in what that can mean for Trump then being an electable candidate.
Sasha Issenberg, how far-fetched is the idea of a Trump presidency?
I think I'm roughly where Stephen is. I think that you have to see that he has the easiest path to the Republican nomination right now of any of the five candidates, but that any Republican who wins the nomination this summer will probably have an uphill fight. Everything we know about the structure of presidential elections in the United States suggests that with unemployment as low as it is right now and the incumbent president as popular as he is, Obama's approval ratings are sitting right around 50% right now, that the Democrats have a structural advantage. That said, we could be moving to a general election situation where with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, we have two exceptionally unpopular nominees. Their numbers outside of their own parties, and in Trump's case, numbers within his own party, are incredibly low. They're just not widely liked. And so there is a potential that could reshuffle the coalitions in certain ways. But Trump probably has a little more upside than Ted Cruz, certainly. But he also probably has a lot more downside in that he's an incredibly unpredictable candidate, and he will unquestionably tack towards the center. I just don't think we know on which issues and with what sensibility he'll do that and what that means for how the Democratic nominee responds.
Sasha, you've been watching the Trump campaign closely. You're in Vegas now. What are you seeing that stands out for you?
I mean, I saw him here last night, and it was the first time I've actually been to a Trump rally in person, and it was everything I had been promised. It was fairly bonkers. Threats of wanton violence against protesters, the sort of ritual condemnation of the media, the odd, totally non-systematic attacks on rivals. I mean, the most amazing thing about the Trump candidacy still is, and this has become highlighted particularly in the last week as at least the political world in the United States has kind of come to the consensus that Rubio now is a stronger threat to him than Cruz, is how much Trump focuses his negative energies on a particular foil at a time. And you would think right now that Trump would be going after Rubio, and he doesn't. He continues to go after Cruz in much the same way that he focuses energies on Jeb Bush long after Bush was a threat to him. And so I think the dynamic going forward will be at what point does Trump unleash himself on Rubio? Rubio's basically been the one candidate in this field who has not gotten any sustained attack from Trump, and I have to suspect that there is, I won't say a logic, but a reason behind that.
And Sasha, so you were at that rally. What was the reaction of the people like? How do people like? What did you feel in the room from that crowd?
I mean, there were of the few conversations I had with voters, there were people there who were curiosity seekers or gawkers. A couple of young guys who were there for the show, but said that they were going to caucus for John Kasich here today. So, we see these large Trump crowds, and I don't think we should think universally that those are all supporters of his. And And as we saw in Iowa in particular, where his numbers on caucus night were significantly below where he'd been in polling, we shouldn't even think that all of his supporters are necessarily voters. That said, there were 8,000 people in a rodeo arena yesterday, and if projections for caucus turnout tonight are 40,000 statewide, he is basically getting close to his win number if just the number of people who saw him in person in the last 2 days come out and caucus for him. That's a remarkable amount of just personal engagement from voters with a candidacy. And, that's the entirety of the Trump candidacy is this in-person spectacle that cable news basically documents in real time. He's doing none of the other things that candidates do to communicate with voters.
So, Stephen Strauss, Donald Trump was dismissed as a serious candidate when he launched the campaign. Did the pundits inside the Beltway especially get it wrong, or has the situation changed?
Well, I don't know if the situation has changed. I want to go back to a comment one of the other panelists made, which is sort of the racial element to this. About 50% of the Republican Party believes that President Obama is some combination of a Muslim or a Muslim born in Kenya. And when you look at Trump's support, the correlation between that group and the people who support Trump is high. I mean, it was interesting. There was some polling. The majority of Bush voters, whatever you may think of, of Bush supporters in the primaries, did not believe that President Obama is a Muslim, didn't believe he was from Kenya. The overwhelming majority of Trump supporters do. So he is still very much, if you look at the size of the sort of birther movement and then you look at Trump's polling, they're almost exactly together. And I think that's the part the pundits never really wanted to acknowledge, the element of the opposition to President Obama that has been racially motivated.
Shayla Nunnally, let's talk a little bit more about that, because you do see you made the point that this is split along racial lines as well. So if we talk about Trump, even if he wins the GOP nomination, how does he reach out to wider Americans, or is that just not possible? How do you read what's been going on?
Well, for one, we see that there's a history of this relationship of race and politics and American politics, and it is also a history that we see connected to the two major political parties. So when we speak of, for example, Trump being able to reach out to other communities, non-white communities, we see that generally there is approximately a 10% population of Black Americans who identify with the Republican Party and thusly vote as such, and that those numbers also vary across ethnic groups of Latinos within the United States. While we see that Cuban Americans are more likely to be Republican, a newer generation of Cuban Americans is increasingly Democratic. So when I turn to a conversation about turnout, that is very important because, for example, in the 2008 and 2012 presidential elections, we see that there was historic turnout for both Black Americans and Latino Americans, such that they were the large percentage of voters who were able to boost the Obama candidacy, especially in the 2012 election. And increasingly, white voters have become more Republican since the 2008 presidential election. So what that means as far as the split among those three racial groups and how it will fare on Election Day in 2016, we really will have to witness, again, turnout and its significance in who could capture the ultimate presidency.
And Shayla, do you see efforts at turnout now? Like, do you see that already ramping up?
I think that it will depend upon especially the Democratic Party and it being able to rally its base. And so while by way of the relationship of the party to especially Black American voters, what that means for the party, which now, by way of the primary elections, I believe has taken more of a liberal stance, appealing to its base, but also the extreme end of the party. Again, as Professor Strauss even mentioned, what it means for that party to accommodate maybe even a middle ground, whether or not it will be able to do that in the general election and thusly appeal to white voters who may be Democrat but also more moderate, it can be the tipping point for the overall election, in addition to that turnout for Black and Latino voters.
Sasha Issenberg, you've studied analytics of successful campaigns. How sophisticated is the Trump machine?
By design, not much at all. For all the talk about turnout, they have focused less on mobilization than any of the other Republican campaigns. The project of not just trying to change people's minds, but going out and find people who already support you but aren't regular voters. And that is a resource-intensive project that is the thing that parties historically have done best in the United States. We have a much weaker party system than Canada does, but what parties do is provide the sort of permanent infrastructure for tracking voters, collecting data on them, and organizing volunteers and staff to go out and have individualized contact that'll mobilize them. Trump's antagonistic relationship with the party apparatus, with the sort of conservative movement establishment in Washington, is going to be a challenge for him structurally, because he just does not have the degree of interest in those mechanics of elections or the level of trust with leaders there. And so
well, let me ask you, Sasha, because you really have, in the Victory Lab, of course, you lay all that out about the structural advantage and how it works, and really go deep into how that works on the ground. Could he change the rules? Like you talk about structural advantages, but he's already changing rules. Could he change more rules?
Yeah, certainly. And, we have not seen an example. When we talk about the effects of media coverage or TV ads, we've not dealt with a situation where somebody generates such an immense share of free media coverage just by going out and standing behind a podium. And so, which is one reason why the mystery of the Jeb Bush campaign is, you have one candidate who spends $100 million on ads and direct mail and fairly conventional political communication, who gets overwhelmed every day in the news cycle by a guy who, until very recently, was spending no money on any of that. So, yes, Trump will be, something we've never seen before. That said, he has only gotten, between 100 and 200,000 people to vote for him thus far. Scaling that up to an election in which, 130 million Americans will vote is a different type of challenge, and the scale that goes into that, those aren't all people who are just getting free media coverage on CNN anymore. It expands to a universe of voters who are paying a lot less attention to politics than usually your primary and caucus electorate. So, yes, this will be something we've never seen before. It may change everything we know about political psychology and behavior, but we may also sort of see the limits of a media-driven candidacy in a general election as well.
Stephen Strauss, we're almost out of time, but if Trump runs for the Republicans, what will change in the Democratic camp?
I think their calculus is going to change a little bit. I mean, excluding the exogenous shocks, I would argue from the Democrats' point of view, I'd be trying to shoot for a landslide election and trying to tip the Senate and make as many gains as you can in the House. I think Trump will be a very polarizing candidate. I very much agree with Shayla's point. It's going to be a matter of turnout, but I can think of nothing that would motivate the African-American community, Muslim community, progressives in America generally to come out so much as a Trump candidacy. And I think you're going to have Obama doing everything he can to make sure that Trump is not the next president of the United States. So actually, there is a possibility Trump wins the presidency, but I think the more likely scenario would be a Democratic landslide.
And what about the chances of an independent, Stephen, just briefly?
I'm assuming that's Mayor Bloomberg is the gentleman you have in mind. I think he'd be an excellent president. I think he's a wonderful human being, but I don't really have any insights as to his plans. Okay.
And Shayla, just briefly, what about the vice presidential candidate? Should Trump run for the Republicans? Can that change something?
I'm thinking once again that candidate would have to be more moderate and thusly be able to appeal to that independent voter who perhaps may not have an allegiance to either of the two major parties. And may I also offer that I think generational politics will be very key for both parties as far as courting votes for young people, no matter what their race.
Okay.
And that's a group that tends to be less likely to participate and turn out to elections. So if they turn out, it could make a difference.
Okay. Well, fascinating to hear all of you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for having us.
Stephen Strauss, the John L. Weinberg and Goldman Sachs and Company visiting professor at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. Shayla Nunnally, professor of political science and African studies at the University of Connecticut. And Sasha Issenberg, contributor to Bloomberg Politics and the author of The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. If you want to know about U.S. politics, read The Victory Lab. I'm Anna Maria Tremonti. This is The Current.